Everyone thought Hannah Whitmore had lost her mind. With $173,000 in debt and the bank preparing to take part of her Nebraska farm, she planted 18,000 turnips across 23 acres, then told everyone she would never harvest a single one. Her neighbors laughed. Winter came, and every turnip died exactly where she left it. Then summer arrived, and the rain stopped for nearly 60 days. As neighboring cornfields began turning brown, something beneath Hannah's soil was about to prove that those 18,000 dead plants had never been wasted. Late September settled gently over the farmland outside Kearney, Nebraska. Mornings carried a dry chill. Afternoons warmed beneath pale blue skies, and harvest dust drifted above the county roads, while combines worked across fields fading toward autumn brown. At 31, Hannah Whitmore had learned that people watched a struggling farm differently from a successful one. She was 5'7", lean rather than delicate, with long arms strengthened by lifting seed bags, pulling fence wire, and handling machinery that had been old before she was grown. Her chestnut brown hair usually disappeared beneath a faded green cap, though loose strands escaped around her temples by midday. Sun and wind had browned her fair skin across the cheeks and nose, and fine lines had begun forming beside her gray-green eyes. Not from age so much as 3 years of squinting across fields while calculating problems she could rarely afford to solve. Hannah was quiet with strangers, patient with animals and machinery, and stubborn whenever someone told her something could not be done. She had not always been that way. 3 years earlier, her father had been killed in a machinery accident during harvest. Grief had changed her without making her hard. It had simply removed her expectation that tomorrow would patiently wait for people to become ready. That morning, Hannah climbed onto the family's aging tractor and pulled a worn grain drill toward the east field. The machine rattled badly over rough ground, and one hydraulic hose had been wrapped twice with protective tape because replacing the entire assembly had been pushed onto a list titled next year. In the drill were enough seeds to establish nearly 18,000 forage turnips across 23 acres. She intended to harvest none of them. By noon, the strange green seed bags stacked beside the field had attracted attention. The first person to stop was Clayton Reeves, whose 800 acres bordered the Whitmore property on 2 sides. Clayton was 61, a broad, heavy-chested man with a square jaw, weather-darkened skin, and a short steel-gray beard trimmed close beneath a nose that had been broken when he was young. He walked with the confident, slightly forward lean of a man accustomed to owning whatever stood beneath his boots. Clayton was not cruel, but success had made him impatient with ideas that could not be explained in dollars per acre. After surviving the farm crisis decades earlier by expanding while several neighbors sold out, he trusted scale, machinery, fertilizer, and numbers he could see. Experiments made him suspicious. He lowered the window of his white pickup as Hannah stopped near the road. "What are you putting in?" "Turnips." Clayton looked toward the 23 acres behind her. "All of it. Most of it." He glanced at the drill. "Planning on opening a grocery store?" Hannah almost smiled. "I'm not harvesting them." That silenced him for perhaps 2 seconds. Then Clayton laughed. Not viciously. Somehow that made it worse. Hannah explained that she wanted the roots in the soil, not the vegetables above it. Clayton shook his head, wished her luck in the tone people used when they meant the opposite, and drove away. Hannah watched the dust settle behind his truck before returning to work. Clayton's opinion was not what troubled her. His interest in the East Field was. The Whitmore farm covered 164 acres, but those 23 acres were especially valuable because they were flat, road accessible, and bordered Clayton's land. He had quietly expressed interest in buying them months earlier. Hannah knew why. Adding the parcel would connect 2 sections of his operation and give his larger equipment an easier route between them. The bank knew their value too. Inside the Whitmore farmhouse, Hannah's mother kept the latest loan papers in a kitchen drawer beneath old dish towels. Margaret Whitmore was 67, a slender woman with softly stooped shoulders, silver-streaked brown hair cut just below her ears, and tired hazel eyes that still brightened whenever Hannah came through the door. Years of farm work had swollen the joints of her fingers, yet she continued cooking, keeping accounts, tending a vegetable garden, and doing small chores long after Hannah asked her to slow down. Margaret possessed a gentleness her daughter sometimes envied, but since her husband's death that gentleness carried a permanent quietness, as though part of every conversation remained unfinished. The debt stood near $173,000. No single disaster had created it. Fertilizer had risen. Diesel had risen. Machinery failed whenever the checking account was lowest. Two disappointing harvests had reduced income, and after Hannah's father died, repairs that he once handled himself had to be paid for. Little losses had gathered until they became one enormous number. The bank's position was simple. If the following corn crop failed to produce enough, selling the east field would reduce the debt before the entire farm became vulnerable. Hannah understood the arithmetic. She simply hated what the arithmetic ignored. Her father had taught her to drive a tractor there. Her mother had carried sandwiches to that field during harvest. Hannah remembered sitting on the tailgate as a child with dirt on her knees while her parents argued cheerfully about whether rain would arrive before Sunday. Selling 23 acres sounded small when printed on a spreadsheet. Standing on them felt different. The east field had another problem. After heavy rain, water increasingly pooled across the surface before slipping toward the roadside ditch. By July, the same ground became brutally hard. Corn roots remained shallow, and the plants suffered quickly when rain disappeared. One July evening, Hannah had taken a shovel into the field after sunset. At nearly 10 inches, the blade struck a dense layer. She pushed harder. The shovel barely entered. She knelt and broke the soil apart with her fingers. Above, it was dry and crumbly. Beneath, it felt pressed together like old clay. For weeks afterward, one thought followed her. Perhaps the field was not simply hungry. Perhaps it could no longer breathe. Perhaps they kept buying fertilizer for plants whose roots could not reach the water beneath them. Now, as the September sun lowered behind her, Hannah made another pass with the drill. Tiny turnip seeds disappeared into the earth while dust curled behind the tractor tires. 18,000 plants, 23 acres, $173,000 in debt, and one corn season remaining before the land might belong to someone else. Hannah rested one hand on the steering wheel and looked across the field Clayton Reeves expected he might someday buy. The rain was still falling on the Whitmore farm. The problem was that the soil had forgotten how to keep it. If Hannah was right, 18,000 turnips might help it remember. If she was wrong, she would spend the next autumn watching another man's combine cross the field where her father had taught her to drive. By the final week of October, the east field no longer resembled the tired ground Hannah had crossed with the drill a month earlier. Green leaves spread across the 20 acres she had planted, overlapping until much of the exposed soil disappeared beneath them. From County Road 6, the field looked almost absurdly alive compared with the harvested corn stubble surrounding it. Beneath those leaves, however, Hannah cared about something no passing driver could see. The turnips were pushing thick roots downward. Some remained narrow where the soil resisted them. Others swelled near the surface before sending tapered roots into cracks below. Hannah had no intention of guessing whether they were accomplishing anything. She drove 30 numbered wooden stakes into the field, spacing them across high ground, low ground, and several areas she knew had been especially hard during summer. The 3-acre strip she had deliberately left unplanted became her control. At every marked location, she carried the same simple tools: a steel soil probe, measuring tape, small hand shovel, stopwatch, water container, and the blue notebook that had belonged to her father. The notebook had once recorded fuel purchases, bearing numbers, rainfall totals, and planting dates in her father's compact handwriting. Hannah now filled the empty pages with measurements of her own. She recorded how far the probe penetrated before resistance increased, how long water remained on the surface, whether the soil beneath the leaves felt damp or powdery, and how the roots developed when she sacrificed an occasional plant for inspection. She resisted the temptation to interpret every small improvement as proof. Hope, she had discovered, could make a person see what she desperately wanted to see. Numbers were less comforting, but they were harder to fool. Clayton Reeves still found the project entertaining. One afternoon, he stopped while Hannah was kneeling beside stake 14 with mud on both knees and a turnip in her hand. The root had grown thick near the top, but forked sharply 6 inches down. "Looks like you're raising some impressive salad," he called through the open pickup window. Hannah turned the root over. This one hit something hard. Probably Nebraska. She laughed despite herself. Clayton pointed toward the green field. 20 acres of good corn ground, Hannah. 20 this year. 3 acres are control. Control for what? Finding out whether I'm wasting my time. Clayton gave a short chuckle. I could have answered that for free. Hannah watched him drive away and wrote forked at 6 inches beside stake 14. By mid-November, the weather changed. A hard northern wind swept across the plains, stripping the last leaves from cottonwoods and pushing overnight temperatures sharply downward. Frost silvered the field first. Then a deeper freeze arrived and stayed. The turnip leaves collapsed against the ground. Within days, the brilliant green field became a flattened mixture of dark green and brown vegetation. Margaret stood at the kitchen window one morning looking toward East Field. That's supposed to happen? Hannah looked up from her coffee. That's the plan. Her mother studied the dead field another moment. Your plans have become strange. So I've been told. A small smile crossed Margaret's face. It was brief, but Hannah noticed it. There had been fewer smiles in the farmhouse since her father's death. Winter settled over Nebraska. Snow came and disappeared, then returned. The dead turnip leaves formed a ragged cover over the soil. Some roots near the surface froze solid. During warmer intervals they softened, froze again, and slowly began breaking down. Hannah could do little except wait. Waiting proved harder than planting. The bank balance continued shrinking. A tractor battery failed in January. Property taxes came due. Margaret quietly postponed replacing the kitchen refrigerator after it began making a grinding noise. Each expense reminded Hannah that biological processes moved according to seasons while creditors preferred dates printed in black ink. She occasionally walked East Field during winter thaws and cut open turnips with a pocket knife. Their once firm interiors were becoming soft and watery. She knew decomposition would take time. What she did not know was whether the roots had penetrated enough of the compacted layer to matter. The answer began appearing in March. A cold spring rain passed over the farm through the night. Shortly after sunrise, Hannah loaded 2 identical 5-gallon buckets into the pickup and drove to the field. She chose one marked location inside the planted area and another in the 3-acre control strip where slope and elevation were similar. She pressed simple metal rings into the soil, poured equal amounts of water into each, and started her stopwatch. The control area accepted the water slowly. The treated ground swallowed it noticeably faster. Hannah repeated the test. Then again, the difference varied from place to place. One compacted section showed little improvement at all. A low area remained sluggish. But at enough locations, the pattern persisted. She put the stopwatch down and reached for the shovel. Several inches below the surface, she found what she had been waiting all winter to see. A turnip root had nearly disappeared, leaving a dark vertical cavity through the surrounding earth. Hannah carefully broke the soil apart. Smaller channels branched away from the main opening. Fine roots from volunteer plants had already begun exploring some of them. She pushed one finger into the largest channel. It went deeper than her knuckle. For a moment, Hannah simply crouched there while cold mud soaked through the knees of her jeans. She imagined summer rain entering those openings instead of running toward the ditch. More importantly, she imagined corn roots finding the same paths. Her first instinct was to run to the house and show Margaret. Her second was more cautious. One hole was not 20 acres. One spring rain was not a drought. And better infiltration in March meant nothing to the bank unless it became grain by autumn. Hannah stood, brushed mud from her gloves, and looked across East Field. The dead turnips had vanished into a landscape most people would have called ugly. Brown residue, softened roots, patches of bare earth, and numbered stakes leaning in the wind. Yet beneath her boots, the field was no longer exactly the field she had planted in September. Tiny doors had opened underground. Whether the next corn crop could use them was another question entirely. Hannah picked up her shovel and walked toward the next stake. She was not trying to prove 18,000 turnips could save a farm. She needed to discover whether they had changed the soil just enough to give the corn a chance to save it. Hannah planted corn across the East Field in late April, disturbing the ground as little as the Whitmore's aging equipment allowed. By mid-May, thin green rows stretched across all 23 acres, including the 3-acre control strip she had preserved through the turnip experiment. For the first several weeks, nothing about the field looked remarkable. In fact, Clayton Reeves's corn across the road looked better. His rows were straighter, emergence more uniform, and plants slightly taller. Hannah forced herself not to treat every comparison as a verdict. Her experiment had never promised prettier corn in May. What mattered was what happened when the roots needed to go deeper. By late June, they were about to find out. The rain stopped. The first week passed without concern. Nebraska summers often carried dry stretches between storms. During the second week, Hannah began checking weather forecasts before she checked her bank balance in the morning. During the third, thunderstorms repeatedly formed far to the west. Dark towers climbed above the horizon, thunderheads turning purple in the evening light, only to weaken before reaching Kearney. Sometimes Hannah could smell rain carried on the wind from somewhere else. None fell on the Whitmore farm. By day 35, the pasture grass had begun losing its color. Dust gathered along fence lines and hung behind pickups on county roads. Margaret stopped opening the farmhouse windows because every passing vehicle left another pale film across the furniture. Hannah began walking Eastfield shortly after sunrise and again near 4 each afternoon. The corn told her more than the forecasts did. In the cool morning hours, its leaves remained broad and open. By afternoon, they curled inward to reduce moisture loss. At day 43, stock ponds around the county exposed widening bands of bare shoreline. Cattle crowded around water tanks. At Miller's Feed and Grain, farmers who once talked about fertilizer prices now talked about pond levels and hay. By day 50, hay prices had climbed sharply as ranchers began searching farther from home for supply. The landscape changed by degrees, but Hannah felt each one. Her corn was suffering. That mattered because she refused to turn the turnip experiment into a story she wanted to believe. Some lower leaves yellowed. Plants on lighter patches curled earlier than the rest. The 3-acre control strip looked especially stressed during the hottest afternoons. Yet another pattern was becoming difficult to ignore. Each morning, the 20 acres that had grown turnips recovered faster. Their leaves opened earlier after the cooler night, and when the heat returned, many remained open longer before curling tightly. Across the road, Clayton's beautiful spring corn had begun losing its advantage. On the 57th day without meaningful rain, his white pickup slowed beside Eastfield. Hannah was carrying a shovel between the rows when she heard the tires stop on gravel. Clayton climbed out. Sweat had darkened the collar of his work shirt, and dust emphasized the lines around his eyes. He looked first at Hannah's corn, then across the road at his own. The humor that usually accompanied his visits was gone. "How long does yours stay open?" he asked. Hannah knew exactly what he meant. "Depends where I measure. The treated section holds longer." Clayton stared down a row. "Mine's rolling before lunch now." Hannah nodded. No one laughed. She pushed the shovel into the ground between two plants. The first 4 inches broke apart like dry powder. At 6 inches, little changed. 8 inches down, the soil was still dry enough to crumble from her palm. Clayton watched without speaking. Hannah dug deeper. Near 11 inches, the color shifted. She scraped away another layer, gathered a handful, and squeezed. The soil held together. Not wet, not even comfortably damp, but it contained moisture. Her pulse quickened. She widened the hole around one corn plant rather than pulling it free. With the tip of her pocket knife, she carefully exposed a pale root descending through the profile. It curved around a small clod, then entered a narrow vertical opening. Hannah recognized the channel immediately. A turnip root had occupied that space the previous autumn. The corn root disappeared into it and continued downward. Clayton crouched beside her, resting his forearms on his knees. "That's from one of them. Looks like it." "The turnips?" Hannah nodded. She moved to another plant and found a similar pattern. Not every root followed an old channel, and not every turnip had penetrated equally far, but enough had done so to create pathways through portions of the dense layer. Then Hannah walked into the 3-acre control strip. She chose a comparable plant and dug again. The difference was not theatrical. The earth did not suddenly change color at some perfect boundary, but the root pattern was noticeably shallower. More roots spread sideways through the upper profile rather than penetrating downward through vertical openings. Clayton picked up a dry clod and broke it between his thick fingers. For once, he had no advice. After he left, Hannah remained in the field. Heat shimmered above the rows. Cicadas screamed from cottonwoods in the distance. Sweat ran beneath her shirt, and fine dust stuck to her arms. The drought was not over. Her corn could still fail. Another 10 or 20 days without rain might erase whatever advantage she had gained. But for the first time, Hannah could see the entire chain beneath her feet. Autumn roots had entered cracks in compacted soil. Winter had killed them. Decomposition had left openings. Spring rain had entered some of those openings. Now corn roots were using them to reach deeper moisture during the driest summer the farm had faced in years. She thought of the 18,000 plants everyone believed she had wasted. They had not stored some magical reservoir beneath the field. They had not created a single drop of water. They had done something quieter. They had opened doors. Hannah knelt beside the exposed root and touched the damp soil 11 inches below a surface that looked completely dead. The water had been there all along. For years, the field simply had fewer ways to reach it. The drought stopped just short of 60 days, but by then the countryside around Kearney had already paid for every rainless week. Some cornfields had faded from green to the dull gray-brown of paper left too long in the sun. On the poorest dryland acres, farmers stopped waiting for grain that would never properly fill and cut damaged corn for livestock feed instead. Clayton Reeves lost a significant share of the yield potential on several of his driest fields. The east field suffered too. Hannah never pretended otherwise. Lower leaves had fired brown, some stalks were shorter than normal, and the ears she opened were smaller than they would have been in a generous summer. But the plants were standing, the kernels were filling, and the 20 acres that had grown turnips continued to look stronger than the 3-acre control strip. In late August, Hannah invited the local extension office to examine what she had been measuring. The person who arrived was Dr. Nathan Cole, 54, a tall, narrow-framed agronomist with sandy gray hair thinning across the crown, rectangular glasses, and a neatly clipped mustache that made his long face appear even more serious. Nathan spoke slowly and rarely offered conclusions before looking at evidence. 26 years of visiting farms had made him skeptical of both miracle products and miracle stories. He had watched farmers spend money chasing solutions that worked beautifully in advertisements and poorly in actual soil, so his first response to almost every claim was the same: compare it with something untreated. Hannah liked him immediately for that. She already had the comparison. For most of the morning, they moved between her marked locations. Nathan examined root profiles, pushed a probe into the ground, and repeated simple infiltration tests in the treated acreage and control strip. Hannah resisted explaining what she hoped he would find. Near noon, Nathan crouched beside an exposed corn plant and adjusted his glasses. There's a difference. Hannah waited. In these locations, yes. Better pore continuity. More roots moving vertically. Water's entering faster in several of your treated points. Enough to explain the corn? Nathan looked across the field. Enough to contribute. Don't make it bigger than it is. Hannah smiled. I wasn't planning to. He reminded her that soil varied naturally across fields, that one season could not prove everything, and that turnips alone had not defeated drought. Plant population, rainfall timing before the dry period, soil type, residue, and countless other factors mattered. Still, the measurements supported what Hannah had been seeing. Clayton came over while Nathan was finishing one infiltration test. He watched water disappear into the treated ground, then glanced toward the control strip. Months earlier, he would have found something funny to say. This time he simply asked, "How deep were those roots?" Hannah showed him. But measurements could not make the loan payment. Hannah needed grain. Harvest began beneath a cloudless October sky. Before sunrise, she checked the Whitmore's aging combine one final time. Belts, chains, oil, hydraulic lines, tire pressure, grain tank, and the temperamental yield monitor she had recalibrated the previous afternoon. Margaret drove their old pickup to the east field and parked beside the gate. She had packed coffee in a thermos and 2 sandwiches neither woman expected Hannah to remember eating. Hannah climbed into the combine. Her hands were cold despite the warmth building inside the cab. She lowered the header. The first stalks disappeared beneath it with a dry, cracking roar. Dust rose behind the machine, glowing gold in the low morning sunlight. Corn kernels began striking metal beneath the cab. Hannah kept her eyes away from the yield monitor. The first 100 feet meant little. Calibration, thin spots, headlands. She knew all the reasons not to trust an early number. She reached the end, turned, and started another pass. Then she looked. The number was higher than she had expected. Hannah frowned. She drove another 100 yards. It held. At the next turn, it dipped briefly, then climbed again. Another pass. Still there. Her fingers tightened around the steering wheel. For months, she had trained herself to think in measurements rather than hopes. Inches of root depth. Minutes of infiltration. Days without rain. Dollars owed. Acres at risk. Hope had always seemed dangerous because it could make disappointment heavier. Now the monitor refused to give her the number she had feared. Hannah's vision blurred. She wiped one eye with the back of her hand, leaving a streak of dust across her cheek. Then the tears came faster. She laughed once, unexpectedly, because crying while driving a combine felt ridiculous, and because she could no longer stop. This was not a record crop. It would not erase $173,000 in debt. It would not buy new machinery or repair every building on the Whitmore farm. But the corn was there. Enough grain was coming into the tank to give them a real chance to make the payment and keep the 23 acres the bank had expected might need to be sold. By midday, Hannah stopped near the gate and climbed down. Her legs trembled slightly when her boots reached the ground. Margaret was waiting beside the pickup. The older woman looked toward the harvested rows, then at her daughter's dust-streaked face. She understood before Hannah said anything. Margaret stepped closer and rested one weathered hand against Hannah's arm. Your father would have dug up every one of those roots just to see how you did it. Hannah laughed through another wave of tears. She could picture him doing exactly that, kneeling in the field with a shovel, ruining perfectly good plants because curiosity had defeated patience. For months, Hannah had refused to imagine a future beyond the next payment. Now, standing beside her mother while harvest dust drifted across the east field, she finally allowed herself something she had considered too expensive since her father died. Not certainty, not victory, just the possibility that the Whitmore farm might still have a tomorrow. The final proof did not come from the yield monitor. It came several weeks later, after the last loads of corn had been weighed, sold, and reduced to numbers on Hannah's kitchen table. She and Margaret sat beneath the yellow light above the stove with elevator receipts, fuel bills, harvest expenses, loan papers, and Hannah's blue notebook spread between two cooling cups of coffee. The crop had not erased their problems. The Whitmore farm still carried most of its $173,000 debt. The combine remained old, and Margaret's refrigerator still made its alarming grinding noise every few hours. But after expenses, there was enough. Hannah made the payment the bank had been waiting for. Because the farm had demonstrated that it could still produce income despite the drought, the lender agreed to restructure the remaining debt rather than force the sale of the east field. 23 acres that had spent a year existing as a number on somebody else's potential sale remained part of the Whitmore farm. Hannah expected relief to feel larger. Instead, it arrived quietly. The morning after the agreement was finalized, she walked to Eastfield before sunrise and stood at the gate. No celebration waited there. No miraculous transformation. Just corn residue, cold soil, and a fence that still needed 2 posts replaced before winter. She smiled anyway. The following autumn, a familiar white pickup turned into the Whitmore driveway. Clayton Reeves climbed out. Hannah was repairing a grease fitting near the machinery shed when she saw him approaching. His steel-gray beard had grown slightly longer, and there was none of the old amusement in his expression. He shoved both hands into his jacket pockets and looked toward Eastfield. How many pounds of that seed did you use per acre? Hannah stared at him. Clayton cleared his throat. The turnips. I know what you meant. For perhaps 3 seconds, Hannah considered reminding him about the grocery store joke, the giant salad, or his generous offer to tell her for free that she was wasting her time. Instead, she wiped her hands on a rag. Come inside. At the kitchen table, Hannah opened the blue notebook. She showed Clayton planting dates, observations from the 30 marked sites, infiltration measurements, the 3-acre control strip, winter kill notes, and root depths recorded during the drought. More importantly, she showed him where the experiment had disappointed her. Some turnips had forked above the hardest layers. Low areas had responded poorly. Several measurements showed little difference. Clayton studied those pages longest. So it didn't work everywhere. No. He nodded slowly. Good. Hannah raised an eyebrow. I trust things more when somebody admits where they didn't work. That made her laugh. Clayton planted a small cover crop strip that autumn. Hannah noticed it from the road and never mentioned it. Over the next several years, the story people told about 18,000 turnips became simpler than the truth. In town, some remembered Hannah as the woman who saved a farm with vegetables. Hannah disliked that version. It made one difficult season sound like a trick. So she kept experimenting. She planted cereal rye on some acres and clover on others. She tried mixtures where one species alone seemed inadequate. She changed planting dates. She maintained untreated strips when practical and continued using the same simple infiltration tests. During dry summers, she dug root profiles. After heavy storms, she watched where water moved. Some experiments worked. Some failed badly enough that Hannah drew angry lines beneath the results in her notebook. Soil did not care about a good story. It changed slowly. Year by year, however, Eastfield began behaving differently. The surface developed more residue and remained protected longer during hot weather. In several tested areas, soil broke apart into smaller, softer aggregates instead of hard slabs. Corn roots increasingly explored deeper layers. After thunderstorms, less muddy water escaped toward the roadside ditch. The debt declined slowly too. There was no single triumphant check that erased it. Hannah and Margaret paid it down through ordinary seasons, careful spending, decent harvests, disappointing harvests, repairs, and the stubborn mathematics of continuing. Years after the first turnip experiment, a summer thunderstorm crossed the Whitmore farm. Rain hammered the machinery shed roof and turned the yard dark within minutes. Wind bent the cottonwoods along the road. Then the storm moved east, leaving behind cool air heavy with the smell of wet earth. Hannah walked toward Eastfield. She was older now. Fine lines had deepened around her gray-green eyes, and a few lighter strands had appeared in her chestnut hair. The blue notebook had been joined by several others on a shelf inside the farmhouse. Water glimmered between the corn rows. Hannah stopped. Years earlier, water after a storm like this would have gathered, moved across the hardened surface, and carried soil toward the ditch. Now she watched it hesitate, then disappear, not sideways, down, into cracks opened and reopened by roots, into pores protected by residue and biological activity, into spaces created gradually across seasons nobody driving past the field would ever notice. Hannah crouched and pressed her palm against the wet earth. Once, 18,000 turnips had seemed like her last gamble on a field everyone expected her to lose. Now she understood they had never been the real lesson. For years, the Whitmores had asked the land for corn, yield, income, and enough money to survive another season. Hannah had finally learned to ask a different question. Not what else could she take from the soil, but what did the soil need from her? Beneath her hand, the last rainwater disappeared into the earth, and the field, given enough time to heal, had learned how to hold it again. Sometimes, God does not perform a miracle by sending more rain. Sometimes, He simply shows us how to receive the rain that has already fallen. For years, Hannah looked at the east field and saw exhausted soil, shallow roots, mounting debt, and 23 acres her family might soon lose. Her neighbors saw something else, a young woman planting thousands of turnips she would never harvest. Then winter came and killed every one of them. From the road, it looked like waste. But beneath the surface, something was changing. Those dying roots were leaving behind tiny pathways. And months later, when nearly 60 days passed without meaningful rain, the corn found those pathways and reached moisture hidden deeper in the earth. Perhaps God's work in our own lives sometimes looks the same. We often pray for Him to send something new. A new opportunity, more money, better circumstances, a restored relationship, a door that suddenly opens, an answer that removes the struggle. And sometimes that answer comes. But sometimes God's miracle is quieter. Sometimes He does not immediately change what surrounds us. Instead, He changes something within us so we can reach what we could not reach before. Perhaps the difficult season you are walking through today is doing something beneath the surface that you cannot yet see. Maybe a disappointment is teaching you patience. Maybe a failure is giving you wisdom. Maybe a closed door is leading you toward another path. Maybe the loss of someone you loved has left an emptiness that will always remain. But through that emptiness, you have learned to treasure people more deeply. And maybe something you once considered wasted, a difficult year, an abandoned dream, an unexpected change, is quietly becoming part of the path that carries you forward. Hannah's 18,000 turnips did not create water. The water was already there. They simply opened a way to reach it. And perhaps there are blessings in your life that are already closer than you realize. Faith does not mean pretending the drought is not real. Hannah still had debt. She still had old machinery. Her crops still suffered. She still woke up uncertain about what tomorrow would bring. But she kept planting. She kept learning. She kept digging. And when everyone else was looking at what was dying above the ground, Hannah learned to trust what was happening underneath it. So if you are in a season where nothing seems to be changing, do not assume that God is doing nothing simply because you cannot see the answer yet. Some of the strongest roots grow where no one is watching. Some of the most important changes happen quietly. And sometimes what appears to be the end of something is actually making room for something new to grow. If Hannah's story touched your heart, share this video with someone who may be walking through a difficult season right now. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what lesson you are taking from Hannah's journey. Your words may encourage someone else who needs hope today. If you believe stories about faith, courage, family, second chances, and ordinary people refusing to give up still deserve to be told, please subscribe to the channel and join this growing community. May God bless you and your family. May He protect your home, strengthen you through every difficult season, and give you wisdom when the road ahead seems uncertain. And when your own season of drought comes, may God give you the faith to keep digging. Because sometimes the miracle you have been praying for is not something coming from far away. Sometimes, by God's grace, the answer has been beneath your feet all along.